They said he poisoned her with his last drop of water. By sunrise, 400 Apache warriors were riding to his door. The land out there didn't forgive mistakes, and it didn't care about intentions either. It only remembered what people believed they saw. Ethan Cole stood in the doorway of his weather-beaten cabin, a tin cup hanging loose in his hand, the morning air already warming faster than it should for that early hour. The sky stretched wide and pale over the desert, the kind of sky that made a man feel small and exposed, like there was nowhere left to hide from what was coming. His well had run dry 3 days ago. The last barrel sat empty behind the barn, its wood cracked and whispering when the wind pushed through it. All he had left now was a single canteen, dented, old, carrying just enough water to keep a man alive if he rationed it down to sips and prayers. He had been doing just that, counting each swallow like it mattered. Because it did. Out here, water wasn't just survival. It was time. And time was the only thing a man like Ethan had left. The horse in the corral shifted, uneasy, its hooves pressing into the dust with slow, restless movements. Animals always knew before men did. Ethan glanced toward the horizon, where the earth met the sky in a thin, trembling line of heat. Nothing yet. Just empty land. Just silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that meant peace. It was the kind that waited. 12 hours earlier, just as the sun had begun to sink and paint the rocks in long shadows, he had found her. Or maybe she had found him. It was hard to tell out here. She had been lying near the edge of his property, half hidden by a scatter of dry brush and stone, her breathing shallow, her lips cracked from thirst. Her skin was sunburned, her dark hair tangled with dust, and there was something in the way she held herself, even in that weakened state, that told him she wasn't just some traveler who'd lost her way. She was Apache. That much was clear, and that alone was enough to make most men turn their backs and walk the other direction. Ethan hadn't moved at first. He had stood there, the canteen heavy in his hand, feeling the weight of it more than ever before. One drink for her meant one less for him. Maybe the last. The desert didn't bargain. It didn't give anything back. And no one would come looking for him if he made the wrong choice. She had opened her eyes then, slow, like it cost her something just to look at him. There had been no anger in them. No fear. Just something quieter. Something that didn't beg. He had seen that look before, in mirrors, mostly. The look of someone who already knew how this ended. You shouldn't be here, he had said, his voice rough from the dry air. She hadn't answered. Maybe she couldn't. The wind had moved between them, carrying the faint smell of dust and sun-baked earth. His fingers had tightened around the canteen. He remembered thinking about how far it was to the next water source. 12 miles, maybe more. In heat like this, that was a long way to walk without enough to drink. A long way to gamble on survival. Then he had done something that didn't make sense, not even to himself. He stepped forward, unscrewed the cap, and held the canteen out to her. Drink, he said. Just that. No explanation. No warning. She had hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand the reason behind it. Then she took it. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, and the sound of water shifting inside that metal container seemed louder than anything else in the world. She drank carefully, not like someone desperate, like someone who knew exactly what it cost. When she handed it back, there was less than half left. Ethan didn't check. He didn't need to. He could feel it in the weight. She tried to speak then, her voice barely more than a breath, but whatever words she meant to say never came out clear. Instead, she just nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if marking something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Then, as the last light of day slipped behind the horizon, she pushed herself to her feet and walked away into the dark. He had watched her go until the night swallowed her whole. And now, standing there with the morning creeping in and the heat already rising, Ethan could feel it. The shift in the air, the tension, pressing down on the land like something unseen drawing closer. Because out here, nothing ever stayed quiet after a choice like that. And whatever was coming, it was already on its way. The desert did not change all at once. It shifted in small ways, the kind a man only noticed if he had lived alone long enough to listen to silence. Ethan Cole had learned that over the years, out here where nothing moved unless it had a reason. The morning light crept across the land in slow, deliberate strokes, touching the fence posts first, then the dry grass, then the worn boards of his cabin. Heat followed close behind, rising off the ground in soft waves that blurred the distance and made the world look uncertain at the edges. He stepped down from the porch, boots pressing into dust that had not seen rain in months, and walked toward the corral with the same steady pace he used for everything. No rush. No wasted motion. That was how a man lasted out here. The horse lifted its head as he approached, ears twitching, dark eyes watching him with a quiet kind of question. Ethan rested a hand on the animal's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the coarse hair, the slow rhythm of breath. Easy, he murmured, though he was not sure if he meant the horse or himself. He checked the water trough out of habit, even though he already knew what he would find. Dry? The wood creaked when he tapped it, hollow and empty. He glanced toward the small patch of ground where his well sat, a circle of cracked earth and old stone that had once given him enough to get by. Not anymore. 3 days without water down there. Maybe 4. He had stopped counting. Counting only made a man think too far ahead, and out here, thinking too far ahead could break you quicker than thirst. The canteen hung at his side, lighter now, the metal warm from the rising sun. He unscrewed the cap and tilted it just enough to see what remained. A shallow line of water caught the light inside, no more than a few inches deep. Enough for a careful man, not enough for mistakes. He brought it to his lips, paused, then lowered it again without drinking. Not yet. The air was still cool enough that he could wait. He had always been good at waiting. It was one of the few skills that did not fade with time. As he turned back toward the cabin, a faint sound reached him, so soft it almost blended with the wind. Not a voice, not a call, something else. He stood still, head slightly tilted, listening. There it was again, distant, rhythmic. He could not place it at first, and that bothered him more than the sound itself. Nothing out here should be unfamiliar. Every noise had a source. Every pattern meant something. He walked slowly to the edge of the yard, eyes scanning the horizon where the land stretched out in all directions, empty and exposed. The heat was beginning to rise stronger now, bending the light, making shapes waver in the distance. For a moment, he thought he saw movement. Then it disappeared, just a trick of the sun. Or maybe not. He shifted his weight, the leather of his belt creaking softly, and rested his hand near his side without thinking, an old habit from a life he did not talk about anymore. The sound came again, clearer this time. A low, steady beat carried on the wind. Not close. Not yet. But coming. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a controlled line, and he looked back toward the open land as if measuring the distance between now and whatever waited out there. He did not reach for his rifle. It still leaned against the wall inside, exactly where he had left it the night before. Instead, he walked back to the porch and sat down on the top step, the wood warm beneath him, the canteen resting beside his boot. He stared out at the horizon, unmoving, as the sound grew just a little stronger, just a little more certain. Because out here, a man did not need to see what was coming to know it had already decided to arrive. And whatever had started with a single drink of water was no longer something he could walk away from. The sound did not belong to the wind, and it did not belong to the land. It carried intention, steady and measured, like something that knew exactly where it was going and had no reason to hide it. Ethan Cole remained seated on the porch, his elbows resting loosely on his knees, eyes fixed. On the horizon where the heat shimmer had begun to thicken into something more defined. At first it was only a faint disturbance, a line that did not quite match the natural rise and fall of the terrain. Then the dust began to lift, slow and deliberate, as if the earth itself was breathing out. He did not move. A man who had spent enough years alone learned that panic did not change what was coming. It only made you meet it wrong. The rhythm grew clearer now, no longer a distant suggestion, but a pattern the mind could follow. Hooves. Many of them. Not scattered. Not careless, but moving together with a purpose that pressed through the air like a drumbeat. The horse in the corral shifted again, this time pulling slightly against the fence, its muscles tight beneath its skin. Ethan glanced back once, then returned his gaze forward, measuring distance without needing a number. A mile, maybe 2, less with each passing second. He reached for the canteen beside his boot and turned it slowly in his hands, the metal catching the sun. For a moment, he seemed to study it, not as a tool, but as something that had already made its decision for him. The water inside shifted with a quiet sound, barely there, and he remembered the way she had held it, careful, almost respectful, as if she understood the cost without being told. He had not asked her name. That thought came and settled heavier than it should have. Out here, names did not always matter. But sometimes they did, and a man only realized which kind too late. The dust line grew thicker now, rising higher into the sky, no longer something the eye could mistake for heat alone. Shapes began to form within it, dark and shifting, still too far to count, but close enough to know there were many. Ethan set the canteen down beside him and leaned back slightly, his shoulders touching the rough wood of the cabin wall. He did not reach for the rifle inside. He did not stand. He simply watched, because there was something about the way they were moving that did not feel like chaos. It felt like order. And order meant this was not a passing group or a coincidence of travel. This was directed. This was chosen. The first figures broke through. The edge of the dust, riders emerging one by one, then several at a time, their silhouettes sharpening against the brightening sky. They did not spread out. They held formation, a long line that stretched wider with every second, filling the horizon from one side to the other until there was no empty space left between them. Ethan counted without meaning to. 10, 20, 50. Then he stopped. Counting no longer made sense. There were too many. The sound of hooves settled into the ground, deep and steady, and even the wind seemed to pull back, leaving the air heavy and still as the riders approached the boundary of his land. He could see them clearly now. Faces calm, movements controlled. No shouting, no rush, just the quiet certainty of arrival. They slowed as they neared the edge of his property, the front line easing their horses into a measured halt, the rest following in perfect sequence until the motion of the entire group came to rest like a wave that had reached its shore. The dust drifted forward past them, then fell away, leaving the scene sharp and exposed in the morning light. Ethan remained seated, his hands resting loosely, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes had settled into a deeper focus. Because in the center of that line, slightly ahead of the others, one figure sat taller than the rest. Still, watching, and even from this distance, even through the last thin veil of dust, he knew before his mind could explain it. Whatever had begun the night before had not ended when she walked away into the dark. It had only found its way back. The riders did not move all at once, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. There was no rush, no shouting, no sign of urgency, just a quiet patience that settled over the land like heat. Ethan Cole stayed where he was on the porch, one boot resting against the worn wooden step, his hands still, his breathing slow, and even as he watched the line of figures stretch across his horizon. The sun had climbed higher now, casting sharper light across the dust, and every detail became clearer with each passing second. The horses stood calm beneath their riders, not restless, not strained, as if they had been trained to wait as well as move. That kind of control did not come from chaos. It came from discipline, and discipline meant this was no accident. The figure at the center shifted first, a slight movement that drew the eye without demanding it. The rider eased forward, guiding the horse with a light touch, breaking away from the still line behind her. The distance between them began to close, one measured step at a time, until the space no longer felt like protection, but something else entirely. Ethan did not stand. Not yet. He let her come closer, let the silence stretch between them until it carried weight. The wind picked up just enough to move the edge of his shirt, to stir the dust at his feet, to whisper across the open ground like something watching. When she reached the edge of his yard, she stopped. The horse beneath her shifted once, then settled, its breath visible in the warming air. She sat straight in the saddle, no sign of weakness now, no trace of the woman he had found the night before. Her eyes found his immediately, steady and clear, and in that look there was recognition, but not in the way he expected. It was not gratitude. It was not anger. It was something deeper, something that carried consequence. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, then, slow and deliberate, the wood creaking softly beneath him as he rose. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He simply stood there, facing her, the distance between them no more than 20 feet now, close enough to speak without raising his voice, close enough to see the small details he had missed before. The way her hands rested lightly on the reins. The way her posture held strength without tension. The way the morning light caught the edge of something around her neck, a small piece of leather or stone that moved slightly with each breath. He tilted his head just slightly, his gaze steady. "You made it through the night," he said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying across the still air between them. It was not a question. She did not answer right away. Instead, she studied him, the same way she had the evening before, as if weighing something that could not be measured in simple terms. Behind her, the line of riders remained motionless, a wall of presence that did not need to move to be felt. Then she spoke, her voice calm, each word placed with care. "You should not have given me that water." Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened just enough to notice. He glanced once toward the canteen resting on the porch behind him, then back to her. "You were dying," he replied. She held his gaze, and for a moment, the silence returned, stretching thin and tight like a wire pulled too far. "So are you," she said. The words settled into the space between them, quiet, but heavy enough to shift the air. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in surprise, not in denial, but in acknowledgement of something he had already considered. He had known the risk. The taste of that water had told him enough. Old metal. Stagnant. Not clean. Not safe. But out here, safety was a luxury no one had. He took a step forward then, just one, closing the distance by a small measure, not as a challenge, not as a retreat, but as a man who had already made his choice and was willing to stand with it. "Did it help?" he asked. She watched him for a long second, and then, slowly, she nodded. "It kept me alive long enough to return," she said. Ethan's gaze flicked briefly past her, toward the riders behind, then back again. "That explains the company," he said, his tone even, almost dry, as if he were commenting on something ordinary instead of the presence of hundreds of eyes watching him from a distance that no longer felt safe. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something close to it, something that suggested he had understood more than most would have. "They believe you meant to harm me," she said. The words came without accusation, without edge, but they landed with the weight of truth. Ethan did not react. He did not look surprised. He simply stood there, the morning sun rising higher behind him, casting his shadow long across the ground. "And you?" he asked. This time, she did not answer right away. Instead, she turned her head slightly, just enough to glance back at the line of riders, at the stillness that waited behind her like a held breath. Then she looked at him again, her eyes steady, searching, deciding. Because whatever came next was no longer about what they believed. It was about what she would say. The silence did not break, but it shifted, tightening in a way that made every breath feel louder than it should have. Ethan Cole stood there, waiting, his eyes locked on hers, not pushing, not pulling, just holding the moment steady the way a man holds a door open without knowing who will walk through it. The riders behind her did not move, but he could feel them now, not as individuals, but as a single presence, like the weight of a storm that had already decided where it would fall. The woman in front of him drew a slow breath, her shoulders rising just slightly, then settling again as if she had made a choice that could not be taken back. "I do not believe you meant harm," she said finally, her voice even, clear enough to carry without force. The words landed softly, but they did not lighten anything. If anything, they made the tension sharper, more defined, because belief was not the same as proof, and proof was what the others behind her would be waiting for. Ethan gave a small nod, not in relief, not in gratitude, but in acknowledgement of something that did not need to be spoken twice. "That makes one of you," he said. There was no bitterness in it, just fact. Her gaze did not waver. "They saw you give me water," she continued. "They saw me fall." The space between those two sentences held everything that mattered. Ethan's eyes flicked once toward the horizon behind her, where the riders remained still, then returned to her face. "And they decided the rest," he said. She did not deny it. Instead, she shifted slightly in the saddle, her hand moving along the reins in a slow, thoughtful motion. "Out here," she said, "what people see becomes truth faster than what is real." Ethan let out a quiet breath, something close to a dry laugh, though it did not quite reach that point. "That is not just out here," he replied. For a moment, something in her expression softened, not enough to change it, but enough to suggest she understood more than she let on. Then it was gone, replaced again by that steady, measured calm. The wind moved between them again, carrying a thin layer of dust across the ground, brushing against Ethan's boots, against the hem of her clothing, as if trying to remind them both that time did not stop just because men wished it would. He glanced once more toward the canteen behind him, then back to her. "If they believe I meant to harm you," he said, "why are they still sitting their horses?" The question was simple, but it cut straight through the surface of everything else. Her eyes held his, and for the first time, there was something there that hinted at the weight she carried, something that did not belong to her alone. "Because they are waiting," she said. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "For what?" Another pause. Not hesitation. Not uncertainty. Something more deliberate. "For me," she answered. The words settled into him, quiet and unavoidable. Behind her, the line of riders seemed to grow heavier in his awareness, not because they had moved, but because now he understood what held them there. This was not their decision. Not yet. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the boards of the porch creaking under his boots, and he took another small step forward, closing the distance just enough to show he was not trying to hide behind space. "Then you had better decide," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle, but carrying a firmness that did not need to rise to be heard. "Because I am not going anywhere." She studied him again, longer this time, her gaze moving across his face as if searching for something deeper than words. For doubt, for fear, for a reason to question what he had done. But there was none of that there. Only a man who had made a choice and accepted what came with it. Slowly, she turned her head again, looking back at the riders behind her, at the long line of stillness that stretched across the land like a held breath waiting to be released. When she looked forward again, something had changed. Not in her posture, not in her voice, but in the way the moment settled around her, as if the decision had already been made, even before she spoke it aloud. Because out here, it was not the number of men that decided what was right. It was the one who chose to stand between them. She did not speak right away, and that silence carried farther than any command could have. It stretched past Ethan Cole, past the porch, past the dry well and the empty trough, all the way out to the line of riders waiting under the rising sun. The air felt thinner now, as if the land itself was holding its breath alongside them. Ethan stood still, his weight settled, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his eyes never left hers. He was not watching for movement. He was watching for truth. The woman turned her horse slowly, the leather saddle creaking in a quiet, deliberate sound that seemed louder than it should have in that stillness. She did not urge the animal forward. She did not raise her voice. She simply faced the line of warriors, her back now to Ethan, her posture straight and unyielding in a way that made it clear this moment belonged to her alone. The riders did not shift when she turned. They had already been waiting for this exact second. The wind moved again, carrying a faint trace of heat across the open ground, brushing against the dust, against the edges of clothing and leather, whispering through the stillness like something unseen passing judgment. Ethan remained where he was, his gaze now following her, watching the way she held herself, the way the distance between her and the others seemed smaller than before even though nothing had physically changed. Because something had. She lifted her hand slightly, not high, not dramatic, just enough for it to be seen. And that small motion traveled through the line like a signal without sound. One rider, near the front, shifted his weight. Another adjusted his reins. A third leaned forward just enough to show attention. It was subtle, controlled, but it was there. Authority did not need to be loud when it was real. Ethan let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling once, steady, measured. He understood now. This was not a crowd. This was a structure. And she stood at its center. She spoke then, her voice carrying across the distance without strain, clear enough that even the farthest rider would hear it, not because of volume, but because of the silence that held it. The words were not in English. Ethan did not understand them, but he did not need to. Meaning was not always in language. It was in tone, in rhythm, in the way the riders responded. The line remained still for a moment after she finished, the kind of stillness that came not from confusion, but from consideration. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the front riders began to lower their heads. Not all at once, not in a wave. One, then another, until the motion spread across the line in a quiet sequence that felt more powerful than any sudden movement could have been. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus as he watched what unfolded in front of him. No weapons raised. No sudden advance. Just that subtle shift, that lowering, that acknowledgement of something decided. The woman remained facing them, her hand dropping back to her side, her shoulders steady. She did not look back at Ethan yet. Not immediately. She held the moment, let it settle, let it become something real before turning again. When she finally did, guiding her horse back toward him with the same controlled ease, the distance between them felt different. Not smaller, just changed. The weight in the air had shifted, no longer pressing down, but holding steady, like something balanced on a knife edge that had not yet chosen which way to fall. She stopped in front of him once more, her eyes finding his again, and this time there was no question left in them. Only decision. Ethan met her gaze without flinching, without searching for anything more than what was already there. Because whatever came next had already been set in motion the moment she raised her hand. And out here, once a decision was made, the land did not allow it to be taken back. The moment held, stretched thin between them, as if the land itself was waiting to see whether it would break or settle. Ethan Cole did not move, but something inside him shifted, not fear, not relief, something quieter, something that came when a man realized the outcome no longer belonged to him. The woman studied him one last time, her gaze steady, as if confirming a truth she had already chosen to believe. Then she turned her head slightly and spoke again, this time not to the riders, but to him. "They saw you give me water," she said, her voice calm, carrying no weight of accusation, only the weight of fact. Ethan gave a small nod. "That part is true." Her eyes did not leave his. "They also saw me fall after I drank." The words settled heavier than before, not because they were new, but because now they stood alone, without anything to soften them. Ethan glanced once toward the canteen behind him, then back to her. "The water was not clean," he said. "I knew that." There was no hesitation in his voice, no attempt to reshape what had happened into something easier to accept. The truth stood where it was, plain and unguarded. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes deepened, as if the answer had confirmed more than just his words. "You gave it to me anyway," she said. Ethan shrugged slightly, a small movement that carried more weight than it seemed. "It was what I had." The wind moved again, brushing across the space between them, lifting a thin line of dust that drifted past his boots and settled again in silence. She held his gaze for a long second, then spoke, her voice lower now, meant only for him. "That water would have made you sick as well." Ethan's eyes flickered, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement. "It might still," he said. She watched him closely. "You drank from it." It was not a question. Ethan nodded once. "Before I found you." The truth landed between them, quiet but complete, and for the first time since the riders had appeared, something shifted in the balance of the moment. Not outwardly, not in the line of warriors, but in the space between two people who now understood the same thing. She turned her head slightly again, looking back toward the riders, her gaze moving across them not as a leader surveying a group, but as someone carrying the weight of what they believed. Then she spoke, louder this time, her voice reaching them without strain. Again, the words were not in English, but the tone had changed. There was no longer consideration in it. There was clarity, finality. The riders did not respond immediately. For a brief moment, the entire line remained still, as if the land itself had paused to listen. Then, one by one, the men nearest the front began to shift. Not forward, not toward Ethan, but downward. Hands moved, reins loosened, bodies leaned, and then, in a motion so controlled it felt almost unreal, the first rider dismounted. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He simply stepped down from the saddle and stood beside his horse. Another followed, then another, and another. The movement spread through the line, not chaotic, not rushed, but steady, deliberate, until the sight stretched across the horizon. Dozens, then hundreds. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched, not in fear, not in confusion, but in a quiet attempt to understand what he was seeing. This was not preparation. This was not confrontation. This was something else entirely. The woman turned back to him, her horse now still beneath her, her posture unchanged. "They thought you chose to harm me," she said. "Now they understand you chose not to save yourself." Ethan let out a slow breath, the sound almost lost in the open air. "That was never part of the decision," he replied. Her gaze held his, and for a brief moment, something softer passed through it, something that did not belong to leaders or judgments or lines of waiting men. Something human. "It is now," she said quietly. And behind her, the last of the riders stepped down from their horses, the entire line standing on the ground, silent, still, and no longer what they had been when they arrived. Because whatever had brought them there had changed. Not with force, not with command, but with something far harder to measure. A single choice, made without witness, now seen by all. The line of men standing beside their horses did not feel like an army anymore. It felt like something older, something quieter, like a judgment that had already been passed and was now being carried out without words. Ethan Cole stood where he was, the sun climbing higher behind him, the heat beginning to press against his skin, but he did not shift, did not wipe the dust from his hands, did not reach for the canteen resting just a few feet away. Because in that moment, thirst was no longer the thing that mattered most. The woman watched him for a long second, then slowly, with the same calm control she had shown since she arrived, she guided her horse forward the last few steps until she stood just at the edge of his porch. The distance between them closed to almost nothing now, close enough that he could see the faint dryness still lingering at the edge of her lips, the trace of exhaustion that had not fully left her eyes, even if her strength had returned. She reached down, her hand moving to the small leather cord around her neck, and for a moment, her fingers rested there, as if considering something that carried weight beyond the object itself. Then she pulled it free. It was a simple thing, a small piece of carved stone, worn smooth by time, shaped by hands that understood patience. She held it out toward him, not as an offering that demanded acceptance, but as something that completed a sentence already spoken. Ethan did not take it right away. His eyes moved from the object to her face, searching, not for meaning, but for intention. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Her voice, when she answered, carried something different now, not authority, not distance, but something closer to truth. "It belongs to my family," she said. "It is given only when a life is returned." Ethan glanced once toward the line of men behind her, then back again. "I did not return anything," he said. "You walked away." She shook her head, just slightly. "You gave me the chance to," she replied. The words settled into him, not heavy, not light, just real. Slowly, he reached out and took the stone from her hand. It felt warm, not from the sun, but from where it had rested against her skin, and for a moment, he held it there, turning it slightly between his fingers as if trying to understand something that could not be explained in simple terms. Behind her, the men began to move again, but not toward him. Instead, several stepped forward carrying tools, simple ones, wood, metal, rope, the kind of things used for work, not conflict. Ethan's eyes shifted past her, watching as they moved with the same quiet coordination they had shown before, spreading out across the edge of his land, toward the dry well, toward the ground that had given him nothing for days. He looked back at her. "What are they doing?" he asked. She followed his gaze for a moment, then returned it to him. "What should have been done a long time ago," she said. Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in the slow recognition that something was changing in a way he had not expected. The men reached the well, and without hesitation, they began to work. No orders shouted. No hesitation. Just movement. Rope lowered. Earth cleared. Stones shifted. The sound of tools against dry ground filled the air, steady, purposeful, as if the land itself had been waiting for this. Ethan watched in silence, the carved stone still resting in his hand, the weight of it now different than before. Not heavier, just understood. He looked down at it once more, then closed his fingers around it. Not tight, not possessive, just enough to hold it there. When he looked back up, the woman was already turning her horse, guiding it away from the porch, back toward the line that was no longer a line, but something spread out, something working, something building. She paused once, glancing back over her shoulder at him, her eyes meeting his one last time. No words. None were needed. Then she continued forward, joining the others, leaving him standing there with the sun rising higher, the sound of work replacing the silence that had once filled this place. And for the first time in days, as the wind shifted and carried a different scent across the land, something cool, something faint but real, Ethan Cole understood that what he had given away had not been lost. It had simply found its way back, in a form he could not have asked for, and would never have expected. The sound of metal against stone carried into the afternoon, steady and unbroken, like a rhythm the land had not heard in years. Ethan Cole remained on the porch for a long time, not sitting, not moving much at all, just watching as the work unfolded in front of him with a kind of quiet certainty that did not ask for permission. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat down over the ranch, but the men did not slow, and neither did the purpose behind what they were doing. Dust rose, settled, rose again, but beneath it, something else began to change, something that could not be seen at first, only felt, like a shift in the air before a storm that never came. Ethan finally stepped down from the porch, the carved stone still resting in his hand, its surface warm now from both the sun and his grip. He walked toward the well, each step measured, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what was taking place. No one stopped him. No one spoke to him. But as he approached, the space opened just enough to let him stand near the edge, close enough to see the work beneath the surface. The dry earth had been cleared away, the old stones repositioned, the depth widened beyond what he had ever managed alone. Rope moved, buckets lowered, hands steady, no wasted motion. He looked down into the well, into the shadow where light barely reached, and for a moment, it was still empty, still silent, still the same place that had failed him days before. Then he heard it. Not loud, not sudden, just a faint, unmistakable sound. Water. It did not rush. It did not surge. It appeared slowly, seeping through the deeper layers, gathering into something real, something that had been there all along, waiting for someone to reach it the right way. Ethan did not say anything. He did not need to. He simply stood there, watching as the first small pool formed at the bottom, catching the dim light and holding it. One of the men lowered a bucket carefully, drawing it up with steady hands, and when it reached the surface, the water inside moved gently, clear enough to reflect the sky above. The man set it down without ceremony and stepped back. Ethan looked at it for a long second, then knelt slightly, his hand hovering just above the surface before finally dipping in. The water was cool, not cold, but enough to send a quiet shock through his skin, enough to remind him what it felt like to have something given back instead of taken away. He brought his hand to his face, letting a small amount run across his lips, not drinking fully, not yet, just enough to taste what had been returned. It was clean, cleaner than anything he had known in days. Behind him, the work continued, but it no longer carried urgency. It carried completion. He stood again, turning slightly, his eyes moving across the land that no longer felt as empty as it had that morning. The woman stood at a distance now, her horse still, her presence quiet, no longer at the center of anything, but still connected to all of it. Their eyes met once more, and this time there was nothing left to decide, nothing left to weigh, just understanding. Ethan did not raise his hand. He did not call out. He simply nodded, once, a small motion that carried everything it needed to. She returned it in the same way, just as slight, just as complete, and then she turned, guiding her horse away, back toward the others as they began to gather, not as an army, not as a line, but as people who had finished what they came to do. The sun stretched long across the land as the day moved forward, and one by one, they mounted, turning their horses toward the horizon they had come from. No farewell, no final word, just departure. The dust rose again as they rode, but this time it did not carry tension. It carried something quieter, something that settled instead of pressed. Ethan stood beside the well long after they were gone, the carved stone still in his hand, the bucket of water at his feet, the sound of something steady and unseen moving beneath the ground. Out here, a man could spend years waiting for rain that never came, years holding on to what little he had, measuring every drop like it was the last. But sometimes, it was not the sky that answered. Sometimes, it was a single choice, made when no one was watching, that found its way back across miles of dust and silence. And when it did not arrive with noise. It arrived the way it always had out here. Quiet, certain, and enough.